Hello everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode I built beautiful engines from Eduard and Wingnut Wings. One of these engines for my Sopwith Camel, the Clage 9B. If you want to watch this episode, click the link on the screen or in the description below. This chapter of the build is the cockpit. Now the Eduard kit is just fantastic. It's a new tool from 2022 with all the beautiful features we like about Eduard. This kit is a Profi pack. It contains beautifully molded grey plastic parts, clear parts, a mask and a pre-painted PE sheet. We can choose from 6 different marking options. All of them look great. Probably I will make the A option, the blue and white stripes one. In this chapter I focus more on the build. I will tell the story and the history of this fascinating aircraft in the upcoming video. As usual, I cut and cleaned all the parts for the first step. I started the build with the wicker seat. We have 2 options, a plastic seat or a PE one. I choose the PE part because I think it's better. Or you can combine the plastic seat with the PE3 part, but in this case you have to slightly modify the PE part to fit with the plastic E11 and E25 parts. All of the options look great. I painted it in desert yellow and put it aside for later. There were ugly ejector pins inside the fuselage parts. I filled them with simple Tamiya grey putty. When all the parts were prepared, I applied a fine layer of primer to create a smooth surface for the paint. Primer is necessary as it shows all the imperfections and makes a perfect base for the paint. What's more, you can use the color of the primer as a pre-shading effect. I build the paint job layer by layer. I like to use a thin mixture and gradually build up the desired color. The first one was the silver for the inside of the cowling, followed by the deck tan for the canvas cover inside the fuselage. In between there was a wooden section. To paint the wood texture I used oil paints. It's super easy to make a nice wood tone. To make a desired wood tone, light wood like maple or dark wood like mahogany, we must paint the base wood color light or dark. This color will be the light veins of the wood. In this case I use Tamiya's wooden deck tan. I like to use white or some light brown for the base color. For the oil I've chosen yellow ochre and dark brown oil paints. I used Arc Spectrum oil paints, but recently I've tried 502 Abteilung products, which are perfect and cheaper than art paints. Maybe the best thing is that these paints are already mixed with the most commonly used colors in scare modeling, like dust, rust, engine grease or grass green. After the base color dries, we need to apply the actual wood tone. I mixed the paint a bit thinner, and with a cheap, scruffy brush, I painted over the surface. The paint job shouldn't be perfect, just cover the area. When it's covered with a light, gentle and long brush strokes, we can create the darker wood veins on the surface. The direction of the brush strokes define the grain orientation of the wood. These strokes don't have to be perfect, but they have to be long and consistent. Don't make them perfectly straight, add a bit of wibble wobble to make it more realistic. If this is your first time using this technique, grab a piece of leftover kit part and practice. You will quickly realize how easy it is. The tricky part is choosing the right color tones to achieve the desired wood tone. The best thing about oil is that it dries very slowly. It takes a day or two to dry perfectly. Because of this, I always overpaint the surface with a protector varnish. I like to use semi-gloss clear as it gives a nice satin shine to the surface. To make it more interesting, we can mix it with clear yellow, orange or red. It changed the tone again. After the protector layer, I left it dry for several days. Now here is the final result. I think it looks pretty good. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. When all the wooden parts were properly dried, I started to paint the final details. I used black and copper paints for the instrument panel. As you can see, I choose a wrong size of the brush. Therefore, I struggle with it. A more pointy one would have been more precise. Never mind, I made it somehow. For the instrument panel, Eduard offers again two options: a pre-painted PE instrument panel or a plastic one. The PE part is really nice, but it's too flat, it has no dimension. The plastic one is nicely detailed, but it needs some work to bring it to life. First of all, we have to paint the wooden base, then the instruments. Thanks to Eduard, we have decals for the instruments. These aircraft had only the basic flight instruments like airspeed, RPM, an altimeter, a compass, a clock and a fuel gauge. I carefully cut around the instrument decals from the decal sheet and apply them on the face of the instrument. Set a correct position and with a cotton bud, I clean the excess decal chemical. I did the same process for all the 6 instruments. There are 2 more extra details that I made for the instrument panel. The engine RPM gauge has a corrugated tube running from the engine to the instrument. To imitate it, I used 0.2 mm and 0.1 mm copper wires. I clamped the 0.2 mm wire as a core in a self-locking clamp, then carefully wrapped the 0.1 mm wire around it. This is not an overly complicated operation, but it requires a bit of practice and patience, as these wires are very thin and it is very easy to bend or tear them. With a bit of practice, you can find the right force on the 0.1 mm wire that must be stretched so that it runs nicely and evenly around the 0.2 mm core wire. If this force is too much, the core wire will bend. If it's too little, the coil will not be tight and uniform around the core wire. It's a slow process, but I believe the result is pretty nice. Another detail is much easier. 2 thin tubes are running to the airspeed indicator. I use 0.2 mm lead wires to make this little detail. After the detailed work, I applied a thin layer of flat clear to unify the look of it. To bring the shine back to the face of the instruments, I dropped a drop of clear into every single instrument face. The ProfiPack kit contains nice pre-painted PE belts for the seat. If you have the weekend edition kit, Eduard provides decals for the seat belts. The PE belts are quite stiff and it's not easy to bend them to the right shape. This time I started to shape it from the end of the belt. I tried to place the belt into the seat and work backward. The most challenging part was when I wanted to twist the belt. These belts were very wide compared to the belts that were used later in aviation. To fix them I used gel superglue. Gel superglue doesn't dry as quick as ordinary superglue, so we have an extra couple of seconds to place the part in the correct place. To hold the parts in their place, I used self-locking tweezer. The Sopwith Camel had a typical design for its era. The wooden box girder fuselage structure is reinforced with brace wires. To imitate these wires, I used Uschi van der Rosten's standard elastic rigging. For this job, I used superglue, ordinary superglue. I needed instant dry. For an applicator, I used a simple thin copper wire. First, I glued one end, and after it dried properly, I stretched and glued the other end. The cockpit is not very busy. The fuel pressurization hand pump is on the starboard side of the cockpit. I painted it dark copper and silver. The handle is whole red. The fuel pipe running to it is a 0.3 mm copper wire. The engine control is on the port side of the cockpit, throttle and mixture control. I painted them silver, and I used a 0.3 mm copper wire for extra piping detail. Later I had to change this pipe a bit because of the seat frame. The push-pull rod running to the carburetor is a 0.2 mm nickel-silver rod. These cockpit frames were also reinforced with brace wires. As before, I used the same Uschi van der Rosten's rigging. Same process, a touch of superglue on one end, after it dried, stretch and then glued the other end. It's quite simple but time-consuming for sure. To finish the cockpit structure, I glued the frames into the fuselage and then glued the rest of the bracing wires. I like to set the control surfaces in a relaxed or off position. Because of that, I set the rudder pedals a little bit of off position. To make the cockpit even more interesting, I added a couple of control wires onto the cockpit floor. There were a lot of control wires. In this diagram, it's clear how many wires are running. This diagram is from a Wingnut Wings Camel instruction manual. The red wires are the rudder and the tail skid control. The green ones are the ailerons and the elevator. I didn't want to make all of them as it would have been too busy and also it wouldn't have been easy to make them. To imitate them, I made two pairs, two for the rudders and two for the elevators. I used the same elastic rigging as before. This rigging wasn't perfect for the job because it's too thin, only 0.03 mm. I checked and the 0.1 mm would have been too thick, so a 0.05 mm would have been perfect, but I didn't have one. So I used what I had. I glued a piece of styrene to hold the other end of the cables. This piece of styrene also reinforced the fuselage. I know these cables are far not perfect, but maybe they are good enough. Now it's time for a bit of weathering. I like to use oil or enamel weathering. This was the first time I tried the 502 uptiling oil products. I used engine grease, dark rust and dust colors. The paint pigments are nice and smooth and it dries a bit quicker than oil paints that I used before. Very easy to work with them. I started with the engine coloring and used the engine grease color. These engine bays were usually very dirty from castor oil. I also used dark rust because it's a bit of reddish brownish tone, so it was perfect for the wood. Finally, I applied a bit of dust all over the place. To make the canvas dirty, I mixed a light brownish color. And the final step was to glue the seat and the instrument panel in place. I used gel superglue to have a couple of extra seconds to set the straight position. The only visible thing are probably the instrument panel and the seat. The rest of the fine detail work will be close to the fuselage for eternity. Anyhow, I enjoyed all the work that I put in. At this point I realized that I had forgotten the control stick. The plastic one in the kit was bent and I didn't like it so much, so I decided to remake a new one from tubes. I used Albion Alloys brass and nickel silver tubes. I used the original one as a sample. I glued the pieces together on the cutting mat after I shaped all the pieces with a diamond coated file. I saw a lovely detail that I really liked. There was a grip around it. It looked like something was wrapped around it, like leather or something similar. I clamped the control column in a self-locking tweezer and carefully wrapped around with a 0.1 mm copper wire. It was easier than the wire for the RPM gauge that I made before because the 0.6 mm tube is a nice and solid base for the flimsy wire. Though I spent a good hour to make it, I believe it was totally worth it. I'm very happy with the result. I think it's much better than the original plastic one. Finally, I could glue it in place. Of course, I set it in a little bit of off position. As on the ground the elevator is sitting down, the control stick should be in the forward pushed position. Also, I set it a bit of a left position. Okay, I promise this is the last one for today. The carburetor air induction pipe was running across the fuselage, so I drilled the hole before I glued the two fuselage parts together. I used 1 mm drill bit and 1 mm nickel silver tube from Albion Alloys. Though I glued it in, maybe I will change it later for a bit bigger one. If you enjoyed this episode, please share, like and hit the subscribe button with a little bell, and you will not miss the upcoming episodes. Stay tuned because I keep working on the camel, but this will be in the next video. I hope you had a good time, keep modeling, and see you next time.